When the first Spanish conquistadors approached the great capital of the Valley of Mexico, they were motionless before a vision they had never imagined. Before them stretched an immense city built on the water, a network of canals, temples, and palaces that surpassed everything they knew. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described the scene with astonishment, a brilliant city that seemed to emerge from the lake, surrounded by bridges and towers where the Aztecs worshipped their gods. The pyramids of the Templo Mayor dominated the landscape, and the markets overflowed with products, perfumes, and sounds that showed a refined civilization. That first impression of the Spanish was the meeting point between two worlds, one that arrived from the other side of the sea and another that had grown for centuries in the heart of Central America. What was life really like in the empire that believed it held up the sky with its own hands? The origins of the sun, from the northern paths to the founding of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs, also known as Mexica, had founded Tenochtitlan around 1325. Arising from migrant groups from the north, they managed to build one of the most organized and complex societies on the continent in little more than 2 centuries. Their empire extended throughout the valley and controlled distant regions through alliances, tributes, and military campaigns. Although the fame of human sacrifices marked the European view, their culture encompassed an advanced social structure, a highly productive agricultural system, and an intellectual life rich in poetry, astronomy, and art. The pyramids, the codices, and the stoneworks were a reflection of a worldview in which the balance between the gods and men defined every daily act. To understand them, it is necessary to place them within the broader context of Mesoamerica, a region that brought together peoples with shared cultural roots. From the Olmecs to the Zapotecs and Mayas, there was a common pattern of urban life, intensive agriculture, pictographic writing, and astronomical religion. The Aztecs inherited and adapted that legacy, integrating it into their own political and cultural identity. The knowledge that is had about them today comes from very diverse sources. Spanish chroniclers recorded testimonies of the Nahuas themselves, while the indigenous codices, created before and after the conquest, preserved information about genealogies, rituals, and conquests. These manuscripts, full of images and glyphs, were not intended to tell stories in the European style, but rather to serve as visual guides for remembering facts. They were memory maps, where colors and symbols represented places, people, and dates. Among the most valuable examples is the Codex Mendoza, which detailed the tributes of each province and social customs, or the Annals of Cuautitlan, which gathered the migrations from Aztlan and the foundations of cities. The modern study of the Aztecs also relies on archaeology, which has allowed for the reconstruction of their development from the first settlements to imperial splendor. Excavations in Tlatelolco, Cholula, and Teotihuacan reveal the cultural continuity that united the peoples of central Mexico. Through the remains of pottery, dwellings, and temples, researchers have identified how political and religious organization consolidated over the centuries. The history of Aztec art provides another dimension. Sculptures, masks, and reliefs expressed their vision of the cosmos and the relationship between life and death. All of this shows a society where aesthetics and devotion were intertwined. Over time, research combined written and material sources to offer a more balanced image. Ethnohistory, the comparative reading of colonial texts with archaeological evidence, allowed for correcting distortions created by the chroniclers. Thanks to this approach, the Aztecs stopped being seen as a violent and exotic empire and began to be understood as the result of centuries of cultural evolution within Mesoamerica. Recent studies have revealed that their political structure, far from being an absolute centralized domain, functioned through networks of alliances between city-states, united by tributes and strategic marriages. The second great block of their history begins with the formation of the Aztec civilization proper. In the 13th century, several migratory groups from the north arrived in the valley in search of new lands. They came from arid regions and called themselves Mexica, mythical descendants of Aztlan. For years they lived as mercenaries, serving other peoples until they found a place to settle. According to tradition, a divine sign indicated the place to them, an eagle perched on a nopal devouring a serpent. There they built Tenochtitlan, the city that would become the heart of their empire. To understand their growth, archaeologists have traced a timeline that starts from the first hunters of the Pleistocene and reaches the urban boom of the post-classic. Between these extremes, fundamental cultures developed. The Olmecs, considered precursors of Mesoamerican civilization, the Teotihuacanos, who built the great city of the gods, and the Toltecs, whose symbolic prestige would influence the Aztecs. Each left contributions in architecture, religion, and social organization. The domestication of corn, beans, and squash marked the beginning of sedentary life, while inter-regional exchange generated trade networks that would later sustain the empires of central Mexico. During the formative period between 1500 and 500 before Christ, villages grew into ceremonial centers. Chalcatzingo, Cuicuilco, and other cities in the valley show the first pyramids and plazas. Afterward, Teotihuacan reached an unprecedented dimension, controlling routes and resources until its collapse around the 7th century. The Toltecs inherited their legacy and transmitted their reputation as wise men and warriors. The Aztecs, upon arriving in the valley, adopted many of their myths and integrated them into their identity. Thus arose the idea of continuity. The Mexica did not see themselves as founders of something new, but as restorers of the ancient order that had fallen with the Toltecs. The migrations from the north formed the basis of their identity. Nahua accounts tell that their people departed from Aztlan guided by priests and sacred symbols. Each stop on the journey represented a test. Over time, these accounts blended with historical memories of real displacements. What is certain is that the Mexica, once established in the valley, had to adapt to an environment dominated by powerful cities such as Azcapotzalco and Culhuacan. At first, they were vassals and soldiers, but little by little they consolidated their internal power through marital alliances and local conquests. Their military capacity and social discipline allowed them to advance until they became a decisive force in the region. The union of Toltec and Chichimec lineages reinforced the idea of legitimacy. The Toltecs provided the cultural heritage and the Chichimecs the warrior strength. From that fusion emerged the Mexica ideal, a civilized people who maintained the energy of their nomadic ancestors. At the beginning of the 15th century, Tenochtitlan allied with Texcoco and Tlacopan to form the Triple Alliance. This coalition extended its control over vast areas of Mesoamerica, imposing tributes and establishing trade networks. Each city retained some autonomy, but recognized the leadership of the Huey Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Political organization and imperial ideology were closely linked, and military success reinforced the religious authority of the ruler. In a few generations, the Mexica went from being a marginalized group to dominating one of the most extensive empires in the Western Hemisphere. The expansion was accompanied by propaganda that exalted the divine mission of the people chosen by Huitzilopochtli. Victories were recorded in codices, tributes flowed toward the capital, and temples multiplied. Tenochtitlan transformed into a monumental metropolis with avenues, dikes, aqueducts, and markets that would astonish Hernán Cortés himself. In the center of the lake, the Aztecs had achieved what no other American civilization had, uniting political power, economic wealth, and religious strength under the same authority. The legacy of that process endured beyond the conquest. Although the temples were destroyed and the codices burned, the Nahua memory remained alive in their descendants. The stories of Aztlan, of the solar gods, and of the destiny of men continued to be told in the Nahuatl language for generations. Modern archaeology has returned part of that greatness, revealing that beneath the streets of Mexico City rest the foundations of a civilization that never completely disappeared. The history of the Aztecs is, in the end, that of a people who transformed their environment, their myths, and their destiny to build an empire that still fascinates the world today. The years of growth, agriculture, labor, and the formation of the Mexica Valley. The territory that the Aztecs inhabited was formed by a mosaic of valleys, lakes, and mountains, where each space fulfilled a function within the economic and social system. The villages, the cultivated fields, and the artisan workshops formed a network of interdependent life that fed the great capital. In this structure, the landscape was not a simple setting, but the foundation that sustained their civilization. From the lacustrine zones to the drier hills, the control of the land defined the prosperity of each community. Population growth was constant, and the demand for food drove agricultural innovations that transformed the Valley of Mexico into one of the most productive environments in pre-Hispanic America. Calculating how many inhabitants made up the Aztec world has been a difficult task. Archaeological and ethno-historical estimates suggest that when the Spanish arrived, the empire exceeded several million people distributed in cities, villages, and fields. In the Valley of Mexico, Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco concentrated an impressive urban population, while in the rural regions families lived dedicated to cultivation and local exchange. The density varied according to the fertility of the soil and the availability of water. The most populated settlements were concentrated in the lacustrine zones, while life in the mountainous margins was more dispersed and depended on cultivation techniques adapted to the terrain. The basis of the diet was corn, considered the spiritual and material center of existence. Beside it were beans, squash, chili, and amaranth, which complemented the daily diet. The Aztecs combined these products with a great variety of herbs, fruits, and small animals. Fish, edible insects, and birds from the lakes were also part of their diet. In the markets one could find freshly made tortillas, stuffed tamales, stews with chili, and fermented drinks like pulque. The balance between plant and animal proteins allowed them to maintain a nutritious and sustainable diet, adapted to an environment that offered diverse resources in every season. The agricultural system that sustained this diet was one of the greatest technical achievements of the pre-Columbian world. In the lake areas, chinampas were developed, artificial islands built with layers of mud, reeds, and vegetation. These floating gardens were organized in grids delimited by canals that facilitated irrigation and transport. Thanks to the chinampas, farmers could obtain several harvests per year, which guaranteed the continuous supply of the capital. On the slopes, cultivation terraces were applied to prevent erosion and take advantage of humidity. In the dry lands, the peasants built dikes and ditches to store water. The entire landscape was converted into a planned production system that combined empirical knowledge and community organization. Agricultural work followed a ritual calendar that marked the moments of planting, harvesting, and rest. Families distributed the tasks according to age and gender. The men prepared the land with the digging stick, and the women processed the food, grinding the corn on the metate to turn it into dough. Cooperation between households was essential, and collective labor ensured that no land remained unproductive. The tributes demanded by the empire were paid with part of the harvest, so agricultural efficiency had political importance. In each town there were local authorities who monitored production and organized the distribution of resources. The rural villages extended throughout the valley, connected by roads and canals that carried products to the urban markets. Most houses were built with adobe, wood, and palm or reed roofs. In the center stood smaller temples and communal buildings where local ceremonies were held. Life in the countryside was regulated by the agricultural cycle and by a social structure based on kinship. Each community maintained a sense of its own identity, but recognized the authority of the empire, which demanded tributes and recruited labor for public works. Religious festivals united the inhabitants in celebrations that combined offerings to the agricultural gods with dances and banquets. The Aztec landscape was not uniform. The lacustrine areas showed a balance between water and land, while the mountains offered mineral resources and wood. Grains and flowers were cultivated in the valleys, and animals were raised, and construction materials were produced in the more arid regions. Each ecosystem contributed something different, and internal trade allowed all goods to circulate throughout the empire. Paved roads and causeways over the water facilitated the transport of agricultural products, ceramics, and textiles. Thus, the territory functioned as a living network where each region fulfilled a role within the whole. Beyond crops, the economy was also sustained by artisan production. Artisans were recognized specialists who worked in family workshops or in larger centers. Their work not only satisfied practical needs, but also had a profound symbolic value. Among the most common manufactures were vessels, tools, ornaments, and fabrics. Artisans used materials such as clay, stone, obsidian, copper, cotton, and feathers. Some objects were intended for domestic use, while others served for commercial exchange or religious ceremonies. The quality of the work depended on the skill and status of the producer, and many workshops were linked to families who inherited their knowledge for generations. Utilitarian products formed the basis of daily consumption. Potters manufactured pots, griddles, pitchers, and plates that were used in homes and markets. Agricultural tools, obsidian knives, and arrowheads came out of the workshops of metal and stone artisans. Weavers produced clothing and blankets with cotton or maguey fibers, which were then dyed with natural pigments. Each item had a determined value within the barter system, and its distribution contributed to the economic balance of the empire. Although the objects were simple in appearance, they showed a profound understanding of the raw materials and the practical needs of the population. At a higher level were luxury crafts reserved for the nobility and religious offerings. Goldsmiths and lapidaries worked gold, turquoise, and obsidian to create jewelry, masks, and emblems of power. Feather workers made headdresses with feathers from quetzal, macaw, and other tropical birds that arrived from distant lands. The elite artisans were organized under the direct supervision of the rulers and the main temple, as many of their products were used in ceremonies or as diplomatic gifts. These workshops represented the union between art and religion, where each piece had to fulfill a symbolic function within the cosmic order. The technical mastery of the Aztec artisans impressed the European chroniclers, who highlighted the precision and beauty of their works. Among the most important craft centers was Otumba, a city in the central plateau known for its production of ceramics and stone objects. Specialized workshops have been found there that supplied both the local market and the capital. Otumba's strategic location, near trade routes and cultivation areas, made it a key point in the economic system. Excavations reveal kilns, tools, and production waste that allow for an understanding of the scale of the work. The artisans of Otumba maintained ties with rural communities and with merchants who distributed the products to other regions of the empire. Their activity demonstrates the level of economic integration achieved by the Aztecs, where agriculture, commerce, and crafts formed a coordinated mechanism. The human landscape of the Aztec world combined rural and urban life in a balanced relationship. The villages produced the food and materials that supplied the cities, while the urban centers concentrated political and religious power. The structure of the empire depended on that constant connection between the countryside and the city. Each community knew its role within the whole, and the tribute became the means that united all under the authority of Tenochtitlan. From the Chinampas to the workshops of Otumba, the daily work of millions of people shaped a society that found its reason for existence in the earth, the water, and the craft. Through them, the Aztecs managed to maintain a balance that transformed their environment into the base of one of the continent's most sophisticated civilizations. The Aztec world, trade, money, and society. When the first Europeans entered the market of Tlatelolco, they were surprised by the magnitude of the place. Before them stretched an immense square where tens of thousands of people traded every day. It was an orderly center of exchange, with streets dedicated to different products, one for birds, another for fish, another for metals or precious stones. There were judges who settled disputes, inspectors who monitored measurements, and temples where the gods of the market received offerings. In that space, the economic life of the empire found its rhythm. The words of the conquistadors made it clear that nothing comparable existed in Europe. Every Aztec city, from the smallest to the imperial capital, had its own market. Some operated daily, others every 5 days, according to the Nahua calendar. The villages that seemed silent the rest of the week came to life on the day of the Tianguis, when farmers, artisans, and merchants arrived to sell their products. Merchandise included all types of food, utensils, tools, and textiles. In the larger markets, one could also get jewelry, exotic feathers, perfumes, gold objects, weapons, and slaves. The variety and organization were so complex that the exchange system did not need direct state supervision. Unlike the Incas, the Aztecs did not centralize their economy. The markets were self-regulated through customs and local authorities. The one in Tlatelolco was the largest market in all of pre-Columbian America. Canoes loaded with corn, fruits, flowers, ceramics, and fabrics arrived from the canals and causeways. It is estimated that more than 60,000 people attended every day. Producers, professional merchants, and common consumers gathered there. The most experienced merchants, called Poctecas, played a crucial role. They controlled long-distance trade, served as market judges, and sometimes acted as spies for the emperor in foreign lands. The rules were precise. Each type of product had its zone, and no one could sell outside of it. Transactions were made by number and measure, and inspectors destroyed false utensils. It was an advanced quality control system in the mid-15th century. The Tlatelolco market was part of an integrated network that covered the entire Valley of Mexico. There were hierarchies. At the top was the Tlatelolco Plaza. A second level was occupied by cities like Texcoco or Xochimilco. The third included head towns like Otumba and Coyoacan. And finally, there were the markets of smaller towns. The large ones opened daily, the medium ones every 5 days, and the small ones less frequently. Merchants traveled several of them in a circuit, offering their products to different communities. Thus, the system allowed the entire region to be supplied without anyone being left out of the flow of goods. Long-distance trade was in the hands of the Poctecas, professional merchants who enjoyed a special status. They were not nobles, but their position was higher than that of the peasants. They traveled for months outside the empire, bringing and taking high-value goods: jade, turquoise, tropical feathers, gold, fine fabrics, and slaves. In their expeditions, they crossed enemy territories and acted as emissaries of the emperor, observing resources, routes, and armies. They were organized into hereditary fraternities with their own laws and internal courts, present in the main cities of the valley. Upon their return, they entered the capital at night to hide the wealth they brought, as displaying it openly was prohibited. In addition to the Poctecas, there were the Tlanequilo, regional merchants who operated in smaller areas. Their job was to bring food and everyday items to the markets: corn, beans, chili, cacao, fish, salt, sandals, or wooden utensils. Some specialized in a single product. Thanks to this division of functions, the markets had all kinds of goods, from the simplest to the most luxurious. Aztec money consisted mainly of cacao beans and cotton mantles called cuachtli. The beans were used for small purchases. A tamale or a chili could be worth 1 cacao, a fish 3, and a rabbit 30. The mantles, on the other hand, were used for larger transactions and had different values depending on their size and quality, equivalent to tens or hundreds of beans. Other objects with limited value also circulated, such as bronze bells, seashells, or gilded feathers. Fraud was frequent. Some merchants filled empty beans with dirt or sawdust, so there were punishments for counterfeiters. The importance of cacao was such that it became a unit of account throughout Mesoamerica. Archaeological excavations have made it possible to follow the commercial routes of the empire. One of the most widespread materials was obsidian, a volcanic glass used to make knives and spear points. Chemical analyses have shown that the green variety from Pachuca, prized for its quality, was exported to almost all regions, even to enemy territories like that of the Tarascans. Ceramics, metals, precious stones, and salt were also transported. Studies on Aztec III black-on-orange painted vessels reveal that they were produced in various areas of the valley and distributed throughout the region, which shows a decentralized and highly connected system. The exchange was not limited to luxury goods. Salt, textiles, and food circulated in the same way. Vessels used to boil salt water became shipping containers, and their fragments are found in almost all excavated sites in central Mexico. Trade articulated entire regions. Peasants produced, artisans transformed, merchants transported, and markets united everyone in the same economic network. Overall, the Aztec economy was one of the most complex on the continent. Population growth drove the demand for products and services, which fostered labor specialization. Tributes fed the state, but commercial circulation kept the material base of the empire alive. There were taxes, bartering, and payments in kind, but most of the exchange was free. It was a dynamic economy, with market components and intense artisan activity, though without reaching a capitalist structure. There were no wages or buying and selling of land, and social mobility was limited by the division between nobles and commoners. Aztec society was organized into 2 great classes: the Pipiltin, or nobles, and the Machualtin, or commoners. The former governed, administered, and owned the lands. The latter worked on them and paid tributes. However, daily life showed nuances. Peasants had some autonomy over their plots and could trade in the markets, while artisans and merchants, though without noble titles, accumulated wealth and prestige. Some prominent warriors received privileges close to the nobility, but the social boundary was rarely crossed. The home was the nucleus of social organization. Families lived in adobe or stone houses, with a single room and a patio where most activities were carried out. Children learned their parents' work from a young age. Boys helped in the field or with fishing, girls with weaving and cooking. From the age of 10, they attended schools where they were trained for adult life. Common young people went to the Telpochkali, where they received military and community instruction. The children of nobles studied at the Kalmakak, which prepared priests, warriors and leaders. Marriage marked the definitive passage to adulthood. Unions were arranged between families, and the ceremony included advice from elders and banquets. After the union, roles were well defined. The man was in charge of outside work, and the woman of the domestic sphere. They wove, cooked, cleaned, and performed daily purification rites, such as sweeping the home at dawn. Female textile products served as tribute or currency of exchange, which gave women an essential economic role. Nobles lived in palaces with large patios and decorated walls, from where they directed the affairs of local government. They controlled the lands, supervised the collection of tributes, and maintained servants and slaves. Peasants, on the other hand, worked plots assigned by the Kalpuli, the community unit that grouped families and lands under the same lord. In the cities, artisans were organized by trade and merchants maintained their own hierarchy. At the lowest levels were the slaves, who were not born into that condition but reached it through debts or punishments. They could marry and own property, and many worked in domestic or artisan tasks. Their economic role was reduced, but their existence reflected the rigidity of the system. Even with these divisions, Aztec society functioned as an interconnected whole. The market provided food and raw materials. Artisans transformed these resources into goods, merchants distributed them, and families sustained the cycle with their daily work. In this framework, everyone knew their place and contributed to maintaining the general balance. This is how the Aztecs lived, in a civilization where commerce, family, and social hierarchy intertwined to sustain the power of an empire that dominated the heart of Mesoamerica until the arrival of the conquistadors. Kings' wars and the expansion of the empire. The Aztec ruler was the axis of the entire political system. Not only did he direct the war, but he also supervised justice, tributes, markets, and religious rites. In the codices and colonial testimonies, he appears as a leader who had to maintain order, protect his people, and ensure the prosperity of the city. The title of Tlatoani, the one who speaks, symbolized his role as the voice of the god Tezcatlipoca, divine source of power. Around him revolved a court of nobles, judges, priests, and administrators who kept the state structure functioning. However, the empire was not born as a unified bloc. It arose from a network of autonomous cities that, over time, integrated under the domination of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs used the word Altepetl to refer to their city-states. Each one was a community with its own territory, temples, government, and markets. In the Valley of Mexico there were about 50, and the empire controlled about 400 more in distant regions. Each Altepetl had a palace, a main temple, and a market square, symbols of its autonomy and local power. These cities were multi-ethnic. Nahuas, Otomis, Mixtecs, and other peoples coexisted, united under the authority of the Tlatoani. Although the empire imposed tributes, the inhabitants continued to identify first with their city before the imperial power. The ruler's palace was the political heart of the Altepetl. The king resided there and public affairs were administered. The temples, dedicated to the tutelary gods, represented the sacred connection between power and religion. The markets were the point of economic union where peasants, artisans, and merchants gathered. These three spaces, palace, temple, and market, defined the daily life and the hierarchy of each city. The responsibilities of the Tlatoani were extensive. He had to guarantee justice, organize military campaigns, lead rituals, and maintain cleanliness and order. The greatness of a king was measured as much by his wealth as by his capacity to protect his people. The position of Tlatoani was not automatically hereditary. High-ranking nobles gathered in council chose the successor from among the relatives of the previous ruler. The process included religious ceremonies and penances, as the new king had to demonstrate dignity and courage. The chosen one presented himself before the god Huitzilopochtli, offered sacrifices, and carried out a brief military campaign to obtain prisoners who would be sacrificed at his coronation. The installation festivities gathered the lords of the entire valley, with parades, music, dances, and offerings. The objective was to reaffirm the union between the new ruler and the gods, legitimizing his authority before the allied and subjugated peoples. The king was the owner of the land and of the tributes generated by his subjects. He dressed in luxury, ate the best foods, and lived surrounded by servants and counselors. Judges administered justice from dawn until dusk, and important cases were passed to the royal court. Despite this concentration of power, the political system was not completely despotic. The councils of nobles and the judges limited arbitrary decisions, and taxes followed fixed rules recorded in codices. Instead of simple war tributes, the Aztecs had a regular system of taxes on land, labor, and commerce. It was a government with features of cooperation between classes, where commoners also obtained protection and benefits. Modern research describes the Aztecs as a civilization with a more participatory than authoritarian model of government. Each city maintained its own organization and contributed resources and soldiers to the empire. Tributes were carefully registered and collected 4 times a year. The most common payment was in agricultural products, textiles, feathers, or metals. The officials in charge of collecting were called calpixque, and their task consisted of gathering the goods and sending them to the capital. This system ensured that the imperial power was sustained by the local economy without destroying the traditional structures of each altepetle. The Aztec territory was a network of alliances between cities. Ethno-historical and archaeological studies have allowed the reconstruction of the limits of these entities, showing that often the people's mixed and clear borders did not exist. Loyalty did not depend as much on the physical space as on the personal bond with the ruler. A peasant could live near another city, but still be a subject of his original Tlatoani. This model of political organization based on personal loyalty and tribute explains how the empire managed to maintain control without the need for a centralized bureaucracy. The relations between the altepetle were changing. In times of peace, they maintained trade, marital alliances, and joint celebrations. In times of tension, they clashed over domain and tributes. Wars were a usual part of politics. Kings sent emissaries before attacking, offering the possibility of peaceful surrender. If the enemy refused, war was declared and the soldiers marched with drums and banners. The objective was not always to destroy, but to subjugate the adversary, so that they recognized the superiority of the victor and paid taxes. The conquered maintained their own ruler, which facilitated indirect control of the territory. War, however, had a deep religious meaning. The battles also served to obtain prisoners intended for sacrifice. From childhood, the young were trained in military schools, where they learned discipline, tactics, and the use of weapons. A warrior's reputation depended on the number of captured enemies. The most successful reached prestige ranks, eagles, jaguars, or special orders that symbolized bravery and nobility. Battles followed ritual protocols, but they were violent and decisive. The main weapons were spears, bows, and the wooden sword with obsidian blades, capable of cutting even a horse with one blow, according to the Spanish chroniclers. In 1428, the Triple Alliance was formed between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, the nucleus that would give rise to the empire. Its purpose was to end Azcapotzalco, the dominant power of the valley. After the victory, the allies distributed the tributes, 2/5 for Tenochtitlan, 2 for Texcoco, and 1 for Tlacopan. Since then, the Mexica power began to expand beyond the valley. The kings of Tenochtitlan promoted reforms to directly control tax collection and replace rebellious local rulers with loyal allies. This system allowed for maintaining political stability and ensuring a constant flow of wealth towards the capital. The Aztec Empire was not a direct territorial domain, but a hegemonic network sustained by military force and diplomacy. The kings preferred to keep the local rulers on their thrones, demanding regular tributes in exchange for autonomy. This form of control was more efficient than administering the provinces with their own officials. The tributes included textiles, food, gold, feathers, jade, and luxury objects. The records of the Codex Mendoza show the diversity of goods that arrived in Tenochtitlan: tens of thousands of blankets, exotic feathers, warrior suits, jewels, and food. Each province had to deliver specific products, many of them not available in their region, which stimulated internal trade. The imperial system combined 2 strategies. The first, economic, consisted of organizing tributary provinces with principal cities in charge of gathering the payments. The second, military, was applied in border zones where allied states were created in charge of protecting the borders. These client states did not pay regular taxes, but sent gifts and troops. In conflictive regions, such as the border with the Tarascans or with Tlaxcala, they served as a barrier between the empire and its enemies. The fortresses of Ostuma and Cuauhtochco are examples of this policy. In Ostuma, the Emperor Ahuitzotl established a permanent garrison and repopulated the area with Nahua families from the valley. The walls and archaeological remains show its defensive role against the Tarascans. In Cuauhtochco, near the Gulf of Mexico, the Aztecs built temples in the Mexica style and maintained a military presence during the conquests of Moctezuma I. Further west, in Malinalco, Ahuitzotl ordered temples to be carved directly into the rock, among them the Temple of the Eagle Warrior, where ceremonies dedicated to the military elite were held. These works not only served religious purposes, but were visible manifestations of imperial power. Each construction, each fortress, and each ceremony reinforced the image of the emperor as lord of the known world. The Aztec dominion reached its maximum extension during the reign of Moctezuma II. The flow of tributes towards the capital was enormous. Thousands of textiles, gold, feathers, and food arrived through the canals to the heart of Tenochtitlan. That wealth allowed for the beautification of the city and sustained the lives of the nobles and priests. However, power was not absolute. Some regions, such as Tlaxcala or the Tarascan Empire, were never conquered. The Mexica tried to justify it by claiming that these wars were only ritual practices called flower wars, but the records show that they were true conflicts without military success. Despite its limits, the Triple Alliance transformed the center of Mexico into an unprecedented economic and political system. Marital alliances, tributes, and imperial ceremonies maintained the cohesion of a diverse set of peoples. Tenochtitlan became the most powerful metropolis in Mesoamerica, a symbol of a civilization that united religion, war, and commerce in the same structure. The Aztec Empire not only imposed its authority by force, but also built a shared identity, sustained by the idea that the Mexica were the chosen ones of the gods to rule over all others. That belief, reinforced by the splendor of its capital and the weight of its organization, held together an empire that, although vast, always depended on the loyalty and tribute of its city-states. The City of the Lake, life and splendor. Aztec cities arose as centers of political, religious, and economic organization. Each one reflected the balance between the sacred and the everyday, between communal life and the power of the state. Of them all, Tenochtitlan was the most imposing, but not the only one. The empire was formed by dozens of city-states, each with its own temple, palace, and market. These cities were conceived under an ancient Mesoamerican urban tradition, where the cosmic order was expressed in the arrangement of spaces. In its center there always existed a plaza surrounded by the main structures, and around it extended neighborhoods, orchards, and canals. Unlike what was thought for a long time, Aztec cities were not simple small replicas of Tenochtitlan. Modern excavations showed that many were modest in size and appearance, although they fulfilled the same functions. Otumba, Huexotla, Xaltocan, or Yotepec showed houses separated by orchards, patios, and gardens, which gave the cities a rural aspect. However, their urban character was defined by the presence of temples, markets, and administrative buildings that served the entire region. The population depended on the urban center to pay tributes, participate in ceremonies, or trade. A typical example was Amecameca, located at the extreme south of the Valley of Mexico. Its central plaza gathered the inhabitants of the surroundings for exchanges and rituals. Stone walls marked the limits between the fields and the dwellings. Each lot had a small orchard, corrals, and work areas. The houses were grouped into neighborhoods or kalpoli, where families shared trades and responsibilities. The heart of the city was formed by the main temple, the ruler's palace, and the market. The three buildings dominated a plaza where games, processions, and assemblies were held. The local market offered food, ceramics, and tools, while merchants brought products from other regions. Amecameca and other similar centers showed that political power was not limited to the large capitals, but that a network of interconnected cities existed that maintained the balance of the empire. Urban planning followed principles inherited from previous civilizations. Since the times of Tula, cities were built around a rectangular sacred area, that concentrated religious and civil functions. The temple pyramid occupied the eastern side, associated with the sunrise, while the ruler's palace stood to the west. On the sides were schools, altars, ball-game courts, and small sanctuaries. Everything was oriented according to the cardinal points and aligned with the movements of the sun. Thus, the city became a physical reflection of the Aztec universe. Outside the ceremonial center, constructions were distributed without a fixed pattern. There were no formal streets or straight avenues. Dwellings were mixed with workshops, minor temples, and gardens. Nobles lived in large areas, with stone houses and flat roofs, while peasants occupied smaller spaces made of adobe and reeds. Despite these differences, the cities maintained an integrated social structure, where neighborhoods shared festivals, trades, and local temples. The average population of a regional capital was around 5,000 inhabitants, although only a few, like Texcoco or Azcapotzalco, exceeded 20,000. In the provinces, archaeologists have found remains of cities that allow us to understand urban life beyond the imperial capital. Cotetelco, for example, was a medium-sized city from the late period. Its excavations revealed a plaza with a ball game, a small pyramid, and several platforms with offerings. Among the findings were ceramics, jade, obsidian, and copper objects. These pieces show the connection between rituals and daily life. In the center of the site, censers with long handles used in domestic ceremonies were found. Although its architecture was modest, Coatatelco shows how even minor cities possessed temples and plazas intended to reinforce local identity. Another example is Calixtlahuaca, located in the valley of Toluca. Its most notable feature is a circular pyramid dedicated to Ehecatl, the god of wind. In front of the staircase, altars carved with symbols of blood and sacrifice were discovered, along with a human-sized sculpture with a wind mask. A large palace of more than 3,000 square meters was also found, with decorated patios and enclosures. However, the city did not follow the typical central plaza pattern. The temple and the palace were separated by hills, which indicates a freer organization. Tombs with jewelry, gold, and fine ceramics suggest the presence of a powerful local elite. Yotepec in the valley of Morelos offers another perspective. It was a regional capital with a palace, specialized neighborhoods, and active commerce. Excavations allowed the original size of the city to be traced, and houses, workshops, and domestic dumps to be found. Urban dwellings were similar to rural ones, small with open patios and internal orchards. The population density was low, which indicates the existence of large green spaces within the city. In many houses, remains of tools, figurines, bark paper, and woven fabrics were found, signs that artisanal production was integrated into daily life. Imported objects such as foreign ceramics and metals from the West prove Yotepec's commercial connection with other regions. The difference between city and country was not as marked as in modern societies. Aztec cities maintained an agricultural aspect, large lots, gardens, and cultivated land within the urban perimeter. At the same time, urban elements existed in rural areas, such as temples, markets, and residences of nobles. Peasants were not isolated serfs, but producers integrated into commerce. This mixture of the rural and the urban made the cities function as flexible centers, capable of adapting to the environment without losing their administrative role. Tenochtitlan, on the other hand, was an exception. Founded in 1325 on an island in Lake Texcoco, it grew to house more than 200,000 people. Its organization responded to a double purpose, political and sacred. In its first years it followed the common model of a central plaza, but upon becoming an imperial capital, the Mexica redesigned the entire city. Inspired by Teotihuacan and Tula, they imposed a grid layout, with canals and straight avenues that divided the city into 4 large sectors. In the center, a walled enclosure of half a kilometer on a side was built, reserved for temples and priestly schools. The Templo Mayor stood there, with 2 stairways leading to the twin sanctuaries of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The buildings in the center were aligned with the cardinal points and the path of the sun. The east represented birth, the west death, and the avenues reproduced this symbolic order. The urban grid not only facilitated transit through the canals and causeways, but also demonstrated the authority of the state. The complete planning of a city of such magnitude was a declaration of power. In its surroundings, causeways connected the island with the mainland, and aqueducts brought fresh water from Chapultepec. Residential areas were distributed in neighborhoods where nobles, artisans, and merchants coexisted. Common houses were small, while the palaces of rulers and temples were built with carved stone and mural paintings. The entire city was dotted with gardens, patios, and floating orchards. The chinampas, cultivated fields built on the water, produced permanent harvests of corn, beans, and flowers. In the canals, thousands of canoes circulated, transporting food, materials, and people. Next to Tenochtitlan was Tlatelolco, originally an independent city that became its commercial complement. Its market was the largest on the continent, and its ceremonial enclosure included temples, altars, and platforms decorated with skulls. After being conquered in 1473, it merged with the capital, forming a unified metropolis that astonished the chroniclers. Those who arrived from the provinces were overwhelmed by its size. From the causeways they could see the reflection of the temples in the water and the constant movement of the boats. Visitors crossed neighborhoods of metalworkers, merchants, and priests until they reached the sacred enclosure, where the smell of incense mixed with that of sacrificial blood. The royal palaces surrounded the inner wall, and each king built his own to leave a record of his reign. The magnificence of these buildings, the sculptures copied from Teotihuacan, and the twin pyramids gave the city a unique appearance in the Mesoamerican world. For the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan was not only a capital, but the physical representation of their destiny. Every avenue and every temple recalled the union between heaven and earth, between men and gods. Its layout symbolized the cosmic order and the authority of the empire. The city became the heart of Mesoamerica, where political power, religion, and daily life merged into a single image, that of the Mexica people dominating the world from an island converted into the largest jewel of the New World. The heart of heaven, gods, myths, and the spiritual world. For the Aztecs, the world was a stage where the gods sacrificed themselves for men, and men, in turn, had to offer their blood to keep the cosmos in motion. In the stories told by the temple wise men, it was said that the gods threw themselves into the fire to light the sun, or that they poured their own blood to create humanity. That mutual pact between the divine and the human became the basis of their entire religion. Blood was the substance that united both worlds. Mexica beliefs were the result of centuries of Mesoamerican heritage. The ancient cults to the sun, rain, and fertility had intertwined with the new deities that the migrants from Aztlan brought with them. Sacrifice ceremonies already existed in Teotihuacan and Tula, but the Aztecs made them the axis of their faith. When their power grew after the Tepanec Wars, the Mexica kings and priests reorganized religion to link it directly with the state and the empire. Ancient myths were reinterpreted to justify the dominance of Tenochtitlan and the need to feed the gods with human hearts. According to tradition, the universe had passed through 5 eras or suns. In each one, a different god reigned, and a different humanity existed. The first sun, governed by Tezcatlipoca, was populated by giants who perished devoured by jaguars. The second, presided over by Quetzalcoatl, ended with hurricanes that transformed men into monkeys. In the third, under the dominion of Tlaloc, the rain of fire destroyed the earth, and humans became dogs and birds. The fourth sun, ruled by Chalchiuhtlicue, ended with a deluge that turned people into fish. The fifth sun, the current one, belongs to Tonatiuh, god of the sun, and its final destiny will be a cataclysm of earthquakes that will devour all humanity. Each cycle ended after 52 years, the time needed for the solar and ritual calendars to coincide. When that date approached, the people feared the world would end. That is why they performed the new fire ceremony. In it, all the flames of the empire were extinguished, and priests lit a new bonfire on the chest of a sacrificed prisoner. If the fire caught, it meant that the sun was reborn, and the cycle continued. The last of these ceremonies was held in 1507 on the Hill of the Star. The myth of Quetzalcoatl tells that, at the beginning of the fifth sun, the earth was covered by the sea. The gods found the enormous creature Tlaltecutli, half woman and half reptile, who floated hungry among the waters. Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca transformed into serpents and split her in two. The earth was born from her upper body, and the sky from her lower part. Rivers, mountains, and plants sprang from her wounds. Afterwards, Quetzalcoatl descended to the underworld Mictlan to look for the bones of the ancient men. There he faced the traps of the Lord of the Dead, Mictlantecutli, and returned with the broken bones. He ground them together with the goddess Cihuacoatl, mixed them with his own blood, and thus gave life to the first human beings of the New World. Another story told that the gods gathered in Teotihuacan when darkness still reigned. They debated who should bear the weight of becoming the sun. Tequistecatl, a rich and proud god, hesitated 4 times before throwing himself into the fire. In contrast, Nanahuatzin, a poor and sick god, ran without hesitation and threw himself into the flames. The sun arose from his sacrifice. Tequistecatl, ashamed, threw himself in afterwards and was transformed into the moon. But the new sun remained motionless in the sky. Only when the other gods offered their own blood did it begin to move, marking the origin of human sacrifice. Just as the gods gave their lives to light the sun, men had to offer theirs to keep it alive. The story of Huitzilopochtli narrated another form of the birth of solar power. His mother, Coatlicue, was sweeping on Mount Coatepec when a ball of feathers fell from the sky and was kept in her clothes. She soon became pregnant, which provoked the fury of her children, the 400 Southerners guided by their sister Coyolxauhqui. Determined to kill her for dishonor, they climbed the hill armed. But before they arrived, Coatlicue gave birth to Huitzilopochtli, who was born adult with war paint, shield, and his fire serpent weapon. In the combat, the young god decapitated Coyolxauhqui and threw her body down the mountain, whose fragments were scattered across the slope. Every sacrifice in the Templo Maya recalled that victory, since the pyramid represented the same sacred hill and the stone of Coyolxauhqui, placed at its feet, evoked her fall. Aztec religion did not form a uniform system, but a combination of ancient traditions and new beliefs. Some deities came from Teotihuacan and Tula, such as Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc, while others were brought by the Mexica in their migration from Aztlán. Huitzilopochtli, their main god, went from being a tribal protector to becoming the symbol of the state. Tlacaelel, advisor to the kings, promoted his cult and placed him next to Tlaloc at the top of the Templo Maya, representing the union between war and fertility. They also adopted gods from conquered peoples, whose statues were kept in a special temple called Coacalco, as a sign of spiritual domination over other regions. The term Teotl defined the gods as sacred forces rather than as human beings with their own personality. They were not close figures like those of the Greek pantheon, but invisible energies that could manifest themselves in different forms. Many shared attributes, headdresses, jewelry, or colors. Therefore, the same deity could transform into another depending on the context. Quetzalcoatl, for example, became a Hecatl when he assumed his aspect as the god of wind. Ometeotl, the dual god, contained within himself the masculine and feminine versions of the creative principle, Ometecutli and Omechihuatl. The total number of divinities was enormous. Chroniclers mentioned more than 200 names, many of them variants or manifestations of the same power. To order that universe, modern scholars group them into 3 main spheres: the gods of creation and the sky, those of fertility and rain, and those of war and death. Among the first was Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror, who could see everything that happened in the world from his obsidian mirror. He was the patron of kings and the symbol of power. He was followed by Xiuhtecutli, lord of fire, represented as an old man who presided over the home and the new fire ceremonies. His presence guaranteed the continuity of life. The group of rains and fertility was headed by Tlaloc, lord of storms and mountains, who sent the rains that nourished the corn. He was assisted by the Tlalocua, small gods who made water in caves and volcanoes. Also belonging to this group was Centeotl, god of corn, Xochipilli, lord of flowers and pleasures, and Mayahuel, goddess of the maguey, along with the 400 rabbits, spirits of Pulque. The earth goddesses, such as Tetehuinan, Xochiquetzal, or Tlazolteotl, represented fertility, desire, and motherhood. Some, like Coatlicue and Cihuacoatl, were also linked to death, reminding us that birth and disappearance were part of the same cycle. The last group included the deities of war and sacrifice. Tonatiuh the sun received the souls of warriors and captives offered in his honor. Huitzilopochtli demanded continuous sacrifices to maintain his strength and ensure the movement of the star. Mixcoatl, a hunter god of Chichimeca origin, shared attributes with the stars and fire. In the underground world reigned Mictlantecutli, lord of the dead, accompanied by his wife Mictecacuatl. To them went the souls of those who died of natural causes. Other gods occupied special places. Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, united the elements of wind, wisdom, and creation. He was the patron of priests and knowledge, and the high priests bore his name as a title. Yacatecutli, for his part, protected the merchants who traveled long routes carrying the products of the empire. Death, far from being the end, was part of the universal balance. Skulls and crossed bones abounded in temples and vessels, symbols that for the Mexica did not represent terror, but fertility and renewal. The same bones that Quetzalcoatl used to create men were the seed of life. The destiny of souls depended on how each person had died. Warriors and the sacrificed accompanied the sun on its daily journey. Women who died in childbirth became companions of the star during sunset. The drowned and those struck by lightning went to the humid paradise of Tlalocan. The others descended to the 9 levels of Mictlan, where they undertook a dark journey that lasted 4 years before reaching rest. Burials reflected these beliefs. Nobles were cremated with their jewels, weapons, and offerings, and sometimes slaves were sacrificed to serve them in the afterlife. Peasants and artisans were usually buried under the floor of their houses, sitting or in a fetal position, accompanied by a vessel and some food. It was believed that the dead continued to be part of the home, so their families offered them food and flowers on specified dates. The relationship between life and death was constant. In Calixtlahuaca and other sites, carved bones with notches have been found that were used in rituals, possibly as musical instruments or reminders of sacrifices. The Aztecs saw in these remains a symbol of power and continuity. That is how they understood the world, a perpetual cycle where gods, men, and the dead shared the same responsibility. Maintaining the balance of the cosmos required blood, songs, and fire. Aztec religion was not just a set of temples and ceremonies, but the expression of a central idea, that the universe existed because everyone, gods and humans, was willing to die so that the sun would rise again every day. The time of the gods, rites, blood, and fire in the sacred era. Aztec religion was expressed in a network of temples, pyramids, and altars that dominated the landscape of every city. These buildings were not simple monuments, but spaces where gods and men met through rites that marked the rhythm of daily life. In every important city, the ceremonial center stood on a large stone platform surrounded by stairways, patios, and minor shrines. Public ceremonies, sacrifices, and processions that maintained the balance of the universe were held there. The temple was the physical representation of the cosmos, a point where heaven, earth, and the underworld connected. The priests were the guardians of that link. From a very young age, they entered religious schools where they learned the songs, the calendars, and the ritual norms. They lived in the temples, separated from common life, and followed a strict discipline that included fasting, abstinence, and penance. Their bodies were recognizable, long matted hair, faces covered with soot, and ears pierced for ritual bleeding. They slept little, bathed several times a day, and spent much of their time singing, burning copal, or carving sacred images. Every temple had several ranks of priests. The highest was the Quetzalcoatl Totlatoani, responsible for the main cult and advisor to the king. Under him were the Tlenamacac, in charge of the sacred fire, and the Chantico, guardians of the offerings. All had precise functions within the religious calendar. Excavations of the Templo Maya have revealed thousands of offerings: obsidian knives, jade masks, figurines, human and animal bones, jewelry, remains of tropical birds, and corals from the ocean. These objects came from distant regions, demonstrating the reach of the empire. Each offering was a microcosm intended to reinforce the relationship between the gods and the city. Around the main pyramid, there were other minor temples dedicated to secondary deities, priestly schools, offering deposits, and platforms for processions. Public ceremonies were the great events of the year. The ritual calendar, divided into 18 months of 20 days, assigned a festival to each main deity. During these periods, cities were transformed into scenes of collective celebrations. The streets were filled with flowers, musicians played drums and shells, and dances lasted all night. Priests led processions with banners and copal burners, followed by warriors with their insignia and representatives from each neighborhood. The entire community participated by offering food, incense, or small paper figures. Sacrifices were performed at the climax of the ritual, when the singing reached its highest point and the drums marked the rhythm of the heart that would be offered. Some festivals celebrated the beginning of planting or the end of the harvest. Others recalled military victories or renewed the sacred fire. During the month dedicated to Tlaloc, priests climbed the nearby mountains with children chosen to be sacrificed, as it was believed that their tears would bring rain. In contrast, the festival of Zip Totec included the flaying of the victims, whose executioners wore their skins during the following days as a symbol of agricultural renewal. Blood and corn, death and rebirth were aspects of the same reality. Imperial processions showed the power of the state and its link with the gods. In Tenochtitlan, the king headed the main ceremonies accompanied by nobles, priests and ambassadors from allied provinces. A path covered with flowers extended from the royal palace to the Templo Mayor. Participants sang, danced and offered incense. Gold, jade and food offerings were made in the temples. The presence of the ruler reinforced the idea that political and religious power were inseparable. Along with the great rites, there were more intimate practices. In every house there were small altars where families honored the gods of the home and their ancestors. Private ceremonies consisted of burning copal, offering flowers, cornbread or drops of blood from the earlobe or tongue. These offerings were made at dawn or dusk, moments considered sacred for representing the birth and death of the sun. Rituals were also performed to ask for favors, health, fertility, a good harvest, or success in war. Healers and diviners interpreted dreams, the movements of fire or the flight of birds to know the divine will. Minor temples, dedicated to local gods or the patrons of the neighborhoods, maintained a constant cult. The priests of those communities celebrated festivals in honor of their protective deity, organized small processions, and taught the young people the ritual songs. Each neighborhood had its own calendar, so in the capital there was always some ceremony underway. Thus the entire city breathed to the rhythm of its religion. Sacrifices, although viewed with horror by European chroniclers, were part of the sense of reciprocity that sustained the Aztec worldview. The shedding of blood was a sacred act that ensured the balance between worlds. Captured warriors were honored before dying, as it was believed that they would accompany the sun on its daily journey. The victims were bathed, fed, and treated with respect until the final moment. Their death was not considered punishment, but participation in the renewal of the universe. The art and architecture of the temples reinforced that symbolism. Sculptures of serpents, jaguars and skulls represented the forces of the cosmos. The walls were covered with paintings showing processions, gods and scenes of sacrifice. The predominant colors were red, a symbol of blood, and blue, an emblem of the sky and rain. In some temples, mosaics of green stone or turquoise were placed, associated with life and eternity. The statues of the gods received daily offerings of flowers, food and copal. Aztec religious life did not distinguish between the divine and the everyday. Every action, eating, planting, marrying or warring, had a sacred component. The temples and their rituals were the center of that universe. From the twin towers of the Templo Mayor to the small altars of the homes, the entire empire functioned as an immense sanctuary dedicated to maintaining the order of the world. When the sun rose over Lake Texcoco, the shell bells and drums marked the start of another day of offerings. The temple stairways were filled with smoke and incense, the priests chanted the ancient songs, and the people watched from the plazas. In that daily scene, the promise that sustained the universe was repeated. As long as men continued to surrender their blood and their faith, the gods would continue to move the sun over the great city of the Mexica. Thus, among songs, fire and sacrifices, the stone temples became the spiritual heart of a civilization that saw in every dawn the proof that its world was still in balance. The era of knowledge, astronomy, writing and the art of the sun. The Mexica people developed a worldview where science, religion and art formed a single reality. The study of time, celestial movements, writing and the arts was not understood as something separate from the divine. Every calculation and every symbol had a sacred meaning. In their quest to understand the universe, the Aztecs achieved astonishing precision in astronomy, medicine, technology, and artistic creation, leaving an intellectual heritage that reflected both their practical spirit and their devotion to the gods. The creation of a codex was a highly specialized process that combined technique and aesthetics. The Tlacuilos worked on previously prepared deerskin or amate paper, smoothed and coated with a base that allowed for the uniform application of pigment layers. They used fine brushes made from vegetable fibers or animal hair to trace precise lines that respected the visual tradition inherited from generations before. Each composition followed a strict order. Figures, glyphs, and symbols were organized according to established conventions to maintain the narrative and visual coherence of the manuscript. The use of color was essential. The Tlacuilos prepared mineral and organic pigments with a refined technique. Blue came from mineral mixtures, red from cochineal, black from soot, and yellow from vegetable extracts. These tones not only embellished the surface but served as conceptual markers within the Mexica graphic system. The precision in their application ensured that the codex was legible, stable, and visually harmonious. Due to the complexity of their work, the Tlacuilos were considered high-level specialists. Their task consisted of faithfully preserving the visual structure of knowledge, ensuring that the transmission of stories, calendars, and religious concepts maintained its formal integrity. The combination of technical discipline, artistic sensitivity, and sacred responsibility made their craft one of the most refined expressions of Mexica thought. The calendar was one of the most precise achievements of their science. The Aztecs managed two systems for counting time. The first was the Xiuhpohualli, or solar calendar, of 365 days divided into 18 months of 20 days, plus 5 final days considered unlucky. This measured the agricultural cycle and regulated the annual harvests and festivities. The second was the Tonalpohualli, a ritual calendar of 260 days, formed by 20 signs and 13 numbers that combined to create a unique sequence. This cycle marked individual destinies and the favorable days for ceremonies, births, or wars. Every 52 years both calendars coincided, and that period was known as an Aztec century. At its conclusion, the people performed the new fire ceremony, extinguishing all flames in the empire and lighting a new one on the summit of the Hill of the Star. With this act, they ensured that the sun would be reborn and that the world would continue its course. The exactitude of their calculations astonished European chroniclers, who found coincidences between the Mexica calendar and the solar calendar used in the Old World. The astronomical knowledge of the Aztecs was intimately linked to the observation of the sky. The priest astronomers watched the movement of the sun, the moon, Venus, and the stars from platforms built in the temples. These records allowed them to foresee eclipses, establish planting dates, and synchronize religious festivities. Venus, in particular, had great importance. Its appearance and disappearance on the horizon marked the cycles of war and sacrifice. The god Quetzalcoatl was identified with this planet, and its brightness at dawn or dusk was interpreted as a divine sign. The main temples were aligned with the cardinal points, and with the moments of the year when the sun reached its maximum point. From the summit of the Templo Mayor, priests could observe the sunrise over the hills and determine the solstices and equinoxes. This precision served not only for agricultural purposes, but also to legitimize religious power, since the control of time was seen as a sign of spiritual authority. In the technical field, the Aztecs achieved notable development without the use of pack animals or advanced metal tools. They built canals, causeways, aqueducts, and hydraulic systems that allowed for transport and irrigation. The Chinampas, artificial islands created on the lakes, were an example of agricultural engineering unique in the world. With stakes, mud, and branches, they formed fertile plots capable of producing several harvests per year. The aqueducts of Chapultepec and Coyoacan carried drinking water to the capital, while the dikes controlled the lake's floods. The tools were made of stone, bone, and wood, hardened with obsidian. Despite that limitation, the artisans managed to carve sculptures, build monumental temples, and create objects of exceptional quality. In the mines of Puebla and Guerrero, they extracted turquoise, jade, and obsidian to manufacture ornaments and weapons. The pottery, with precise forms and polychrome decorations, served both for domestic use and for religious rites. Medicine was another field of advanced knowledge. The doctors, called Tisitl, combined empirical observation with religious principles. They diagnosed diseases by symptoms, pulse, or dreams, and applied treatments based on plants, minerals, and rituals. Among their remedies, they used herbs like quapatli for fevers, istakpatli for wounds, and yotli to soothe pain. They knew how to apply plasters, suture wounds, and set fractures. They also practiced bloodletting and steam baths in the temescales, which served to purify the body and spirit. More than 100 medicinal plants are mentioned in the codices, many of which are still used in modern herbalism. Aztec art reflected the same balance between the material and the divine. The stone sculptures represented gods, animals, and warriors with impressive realism. The artists knew proportions and techniques that gave movement and expression to the figures. The masks of turquoise and obsidian combined precious materials to symbolize power and eternity. In the palaces and temples, the walls were painted with scenes of battles, offerings, and ceremonies. The color red was associated with the sun and blood, blue with the sky and water, and green with life and corn. Each shade had a ritual value. The goldsmithing workshops produced fine objects of gold and silver, although few survived after the conquest. The chroniclers described necklaces, discs, and diadems decorated with feathers and precious stones. Featherwork reached an exceptional level. The Mexicas, specialized artisans, made headdresses, cloaks, and shields with feathers from the quetzal, parrot or heron, which were sewn with maguey thread onto cloth or paper. These pieces were offerings to the gods and symbols of royal power. Literature and poetry occupied a central place in Mexica culture. The poets, called Cuicapic, composed songs dedicated to the gods, to war, or to the fleetingness of life. Their works were transmitted orally and recited with the accompaniment of drums and flutes. The texts, known as Mexican songs, collect some of those poems, where a deep reflection on human destiny is perceived. Life as a dream, death as a transit toward the eternal flower. Rulers and priests also wrote philosophical discourses called Huehuetlatoli, in which virtues, prudence, and respect for the gods were taught. Musical art accompanied all important activities. In the temples, musicians marked the rhythm of sacrifices and processions. In the palaces, choirs chanted hymns during state ceremonies. The instruments were varied: hollow wooden drums called huhuatl, conch shells, clay flutes, rattles, whistles, and trumpets. Orchestras could include dozens of musicians, and each piece had a ritual purpose. Songs at dawn greeted the sun, and those at dusk bade farewell to its light. In agricultural festivals, dancers spun in circles to the beat of drums, representing the movement of the cosmos. Dance, considered a sacred language, was an essential part of ceremonial life. The steps and gestures had precise meanings, and the participants wore costumes that represented animals or gods. In the Templo Mayor, dances were performed in formation, with hundreds of people moving in unison. The chroniclers described the perfection of the movements, the discipline, and the visual impact of the costumes covered with feathers and gold. Every festivity had its own choreography. Some evoked battles, others narrated myths or gave thanks for the harvests. The Mexica thought integrated all these expressions, science, writing, astronomy, medicine, and art, into a single conception of the world. For them, knowledge was a form of service to the gods. Observing the stars, painting codices, carving a mask, or singing a poem were acts of devotion. In that union of reason and faith, the Aztecs left a legacy that, despite the subsequent destruction, continues to reveal the depth and ingenuity of a civilization that understood the universe as a great codex where everything, the sun, man, and stone, was part of the same eternal language. The fall of the empire and the birth of Mexico. In the years that followed 1500, the Mexica civilization reached its highest point. Cities prospered, temples shone over the lakes, and the road network united distant provinces under a single power. But that fullness would be brief. In 1519, a small group of Europeans changed the destiny of Mesoamerica forever. Among them arrived Hernán Cortés, accompanied by unknown weapons, horses, and an ambition that knew no limits. The Aztec Empire was living its last great stage. The period known as Late Aztec B started in 1428 with the formation of the Triple Alliance. For almost a century, this union had brought stability and growth. Markets expanded, trade flourished, and artisanal work reached never-before-seen levels. The population increased rapidly, and new fields were opened to cultivation to feed millions of people. Religion maintained the cohesion of the system, and under its protection, advances in medicine, astronomy, poetry, and architecture emerged. However, the brilliance concealed deep cracks. Inequality was accentuated. Peasants endured increasingly heavy tributes, and famines began to strike frequently. Even so, the Mexica maintained their faith in the balance of the universe, without knowing that soon that order would collapse. When the Spanish landed on the Gulf coasts, rumors spread to Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma heard news of bearded men arriving from the east, dressed in iron and mounted on unknown beasts. From Cuba, Cortés had sailed with 11 ships and 500 soldiers, disobeying his governor's order. By his side traveled essential interpreters, Geronimo de Aguilar, who mastered Maya, and Malintzin, a young noble sold as a slave who spoke Nahuatl and Maya. With them, the captain could communicate with all the peoples along the way. In Potonchan, the Spanish defeated a local army and received Malintzin as part of a tribute. Shortly after, they arrived in Totonac lands, where they were received with caution and with gifts sent by Moctezuma himself. Among the gifts were gold, quetzal feathers and fine textiles. The Spanish took them eagerly, revealing their true motivation. The messengers returned alarmed to the capital, while Cortés secured alliances with the peoples who resented the Mexica domination. The Totonacapan became their first ally. Cortés captured Moctezuma's tribute collectors and exhibited them as a symbol of rebellion. Shortly after, he marched toward Tlaxcala, the only independent lordship in the region. After fierce battles, the Tlaxcalans joined his cause. With them, the Spanish now had thousands of indigenous warriors, a decisive force to advance toward the heart of the empire. Moctezuma tried to stop them through offerings and messages, but every gift of gold only fueled the desire for conquest. In Cholula, a sacred city, Cortés suspected an ambush and ordered a massacre that left thousands dead. From there, the mixed army marched toward the Valley of Mexico. Upon arrival, the foreigners were astonished at the vision of Tenochtitlan, a metropolis built on the water, with causeways, temples and markets that rivaled the great cities of the world. The 8th of November 1519, the two worlds met. Moctezuma descended from his litter to greet Cortés. Both exchanged necklaces and ceremonial words. The emperor hosted the visitors in the palace of Axiacatl, but he was soon taken prisoner. Even captive, he continued to govern under Spanish surveillance. The balance lasted briefly. When Cortés left for the coast to face another expedition sent against him, he left Pedro de Alvarado in command. The latter, fearful of a rebellion, attacked a religious ritual and caused a slaughter. The people responded with fury. Upon returning, Cortés found the city at war. Moctezuma died in the midst of the chaos, perhaps by Spanish hands, perhaps by a stone thrown by his own people. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, the conquerors tried to flee loaded with gold. Many perished in the capital's canals and bridges. That day was recorded as the Sad Night. The survivors reached Tlaxcala, where they reorganized their forces. The fate of the empire was already decided. A new epidemic, brought by a sick soldier, began to spread: smallpox. In a few months it killed tens of thousands, including the new emperor Cuitlahuac. When Cortés returned in 1521, he brought Spanish reinforcements and about 70,000 indigenous allies. The final siege lasted 3 months. The canals were blocked, the aqueducts destroyed, and hunger spread throughout the city. The Mexica resisted until the 13th of August, the day Cuauhtémoc was captured. With him fell Tenochtitlan, and with it ended an era of Mesoamerica. The conquest was not the work of a few European men, but the result of a lethal combination: local alliances, military superiority, and unknown diseases. In barely 2 years, the most powerful empire on the continent crumbled. The survivors were subjected to a new order, dominated by the cross and gold. After the victory, a profound transformation began. The Nahua peoples, heirs of the Aztecs, began to live under the Spanish colonial system. The city of Mexico was founded on the ruins of the Templo Mayor, and the crown distributed lands and communities among the conquerors under the encomienda regime. Indigenous people had to provide labor and products in exchange for protection and evangelization. In practice, that was a form of slavery. Throughout the 16th century, epidemics of measles, typhus, and other diseases continued to decimate the population. In less than 60 years, the number of inhabitants in the valley was reduced by almost 90%. Villages were depopulated, and the survivors were grouped into new towns called congregations, where churches were erected over the ancient pyramids. Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars learned Nahuatl to preach and baptize thousands of people. Many of them studied the ancient religion to better understand the new converts. The conversion, however, was not total. The old symbols mingled with the new. Sacred stones were embedded in the walls of the convents, and Christian festivals adopted pre-Hispanic dances and songs. For the Nahuas, religion continued to be a collective, not individual matter. Thus was born a hybrid faith that still defines popular Mexican Catholicism today. Meanwhile, the people continued cultivating their lands and manufacturing pottery and textiles as before. Peasants barely perceived the difference between serving a Mexican emperor or a Spanish king. In rural areas, daily life changed slowly. The houses, tools, and utensils were the same, and the markets continued to function as in ancient times. In the cities, however, European products spread faster. Glazed pottery, iron, and horses transformed urban life. With the passage of the centuries, indigenous languages gave way to Spanish, although Nahuatl survived in remote regions. A mestizo society emerged, a mixture of blood and customs. The Aztec legacy did not disappear. It remained alive in the food, in the rituals, in the words, and in the identity of the new country that would later be Mexico. Today, more than 1 million people still speak Nahuatl and maintain traditions that date back to ancient Tenochtitlan. In the towns of central Mexico, adobe houses are built on stone foundations like those of their ancestors. Tortillas and mole are prepared with the same ingredients of the past, and cloth is woven on backstrap looms as it was 500 years ago. The European heritage intertwined with the indigenous one. Pork, rice, and wheat coexisted with corn, chili, and beans. In the modern capital, the ancient site of Tlatelolco was transformed into the plaza of the three cultures. There, the Aztec ruins, the colonial church, and the modern buildings stand side by side, recalling the fusion of three eras. In that same place, a plaque commemorates the fall of the empire with these words: "It was neither triumph nor defeat, but the painful birth of the mestizo people that is Mexico today." The symbol of the eagle upon the nopal devouring a serpent still presides over the national flag. It is the image that, according to legend, guided the Mexica in the founding of their city. 5 centuries later, it represents the union between the indigenous past and the modern present. Archaeologists continue to excavate the Templo Maya, discovering offerings, sculptures, and traces of a civilization that, although destroyed, never entirely disappeared. The words of the indigenous chronicler Fernando de Alvarado Tezozomoc, written around 1600, seem to be fulfilled. "It will never be lost, it will never be forgotten. We, their children, will tell it to those who have not yet been born." The history of the Aztecs is still alive, not only in the stones but in the language, in the markets, and in the identity of an entire people. In every tortilla, in every Nahuatl word, in every celebration, breathes the memory of an empire that fell, but whose sun never stopped shining.